please read that one for us again?
Yes, absolutely. I would
And
be
especially
delighted
in
to.
light of that like discussion we just had, let's read it again and let us keep those thoughts in mind.
Indeed, I'm delighted to read this poem. This poem's titled "How Poetry Works," and it may be my version of Ars Poetica, or at least the closest I've written one to date. Uh, how poetry works. It cannot end, for it never began. It comes from within, somewhere between middle fringe and out of scope. It requires vast sums of silence, memory as deep as the sea, murky and forgetful in all the right places, a fierce readiness to reverse. It lives alone in holy company, reading, painting, sleeping, breathing, singing in concert with rain or autumn leaves beyond the window pane. It needs no screen to know the news, who is winning or losing, what next may disappear. The master of waiting is watching a fire, which never consumes and never relents. Thank you.
So, and that's a great poem for us to lead into my first question or two for you, David. Um, give us your thoughts on poetry. Give us your thoughts on what it is that you would like all of us to understand about you as a poet, what it is, how you um, perceive your poetry, why you write the way you do, um, what inspires you, um, and what do you have difficulty with?
Yes, these are great questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share. That poem may be the closest that I've come yet to a philosophy of what it feels like for me to write poetry. This was a poem that caught me by surprise. It was not what I had in mind when I sat down to write. And sometimes it's very joyful when it happens. Those poems come to me in that fashion, not necessarily what I was looking for. Uh, but there are some very clear facts in my own process that are embedded in that poem. The vast sums of silence is definitely one of them. I have to be in silence, and that's where poetry comes from for me. And also, oh, we commented, and you had mentioned, Steve, about the fierce readiness to reverse. For me, I feel like not only does that come up in my poetry process, but also my life process in some ways when I find I'm getting so locked in into how something should look or feel or behave, having the readiness to go in another direction is when surprise happens. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about poetry. So those are just some of the thoughts that come to mind when I think about my poetry process. And one of the last things is there's a lot of imagery in my poetry that is intentional. I really love image and playing with image, and um, and so perhaps maybe some of the other poems that I'll read, you'll see different elements that play there.
Tell me about your, all right, tell me about your thoughts about silence and silence in the relationship to poetry and silence in relationship to imagery.
Hmm. Silence in relation to poetry may be easier to answer. Some of the experiences that I've had directly have informed that years before I realized I was writing poetry. I grew up outside of New York City, with not a lot of silence, and there still isn't. Um, and I joined the military, and I was living in the desert for 3 years, which was a vast departure from what I had been used to and growing up. And also, I spent a year in Japan, about 1 hour south of Hiroshima. And those experiences, especially early in my young adulthood, gave me a very sharp contrast to the noise and the activity that I've been used to. Um, and I had a lot of time to think and to listen. And so it was through those years that I really started to write. At that time, I would just grab a journal and put some thoughts on paper, but I didn't think of it as poetry. I just thought this is something that I did. It took a while for me to accept the fact that I was actually a poet and a writer. So I think there's a very close relationship between creativity and silence. I do hear musicians talk about this as well. Um, where does music come from? Things like that is a very interesting and probing question. I don't know if I can ever answer it, but that's sort of where poetry comes from as well. It does come from that silence, I think.
Do you do you think for you to get into that zone of silence, do you need to be like still? Do you need to be seated in a still area for you, or is walking in a silent area better for you?
Hmm. Well, the environment definitely has a huge role. So being in nature is a great way for me to get closer to that silence that I'm looking for when I write poetry. Although there is an element that I try to cultivate from time to time, being in a busy place, maybe a busy city, or surrounded by people, and to also, access that place of inner silence. In those moments, I have a little small notebook that I carry around with me, and it doesn't happen as often, but every now and then a line or two may emerge that's worth capturing. But I do think that that silence is with us if we're aware of it,
You
wherever
know,
we are.
everything that you're saying resonates so closely with me, um, about silence, about memory. Um, and as you mentioned, the how this poem kind of caught you by surprise. Do you feel that the bulk of your poem is more caught by surprise or more um, thought out, intentional? Okay, I'm going to write I need to write a poem about X, and you sit down and work on it, or does it more often catch you by surprise?
That's a great question. The In the beginning of writing and developing as a poet, it was definitely elements of surprise. There were things that I wrote, and then I sat in a drawer for 5 years before I was willing to look at it and develop it and even show anyone. So I feel like there was a lot of a surprise and wayfinding, if you will, not necessarily the courage to sit down and take a topic and to take it on. Um, Lately, I have been writing more intentionally. So I was a part of a project that I think some others were a part of in the Poetry Society, the Writing the Land project, where I was paired with a um, environmental preservation site for an entire year. So it gave me a lot of time in that year to walk, to hike, to research, and to really think about this place and write a poem in tribute to its history. And that was very, very enjoyable. But more often, I did mention memory being a huge component. Many of the things that I write are in tribute to places that I've lived or people that are important to me. And don't necessarily go searching for those moments to write that out, but there are times when a memory of someone important to me comes on particularly strong. And in those instances, it's easier, I would say, to craft a poem
You know, I
yeah.
agree completely. It's like almost all of my poetry catches me by surprise, unawares and unprepared. Um, I find that and I haven't been writing that long actually, but my beginnings have been much similar to yours as a poet, and I find that like when I have a task, when I'm in some kind of poetic exercise and I have to write a poem about a certain thing or a certain topic, that is much more of a struggle for me than writing what catches me by surprise and going with it and just following the lead and just kind of just transcribing it. So yeah, that's all really, that really strikes home for me. Well, that's really all well thought through, David, and really a great illumination into how you approach poetry. Would you like to read us another poem or two?
Certainly. This next poem that I'll read came out of a prompt that I participated in at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valleys. I live in Winchester. I've been in Winchester for about 17 years. It's home, and I love living in the valley. And this particular prompt, the question that we were given in this poetry workshop was to write about a time where we felt loved. And this poem really took me by surprise. It's set in New York City, and I'll read it. And well, let's just go into it. This one's called The Mayfair. Horizons in a single frame. On East 74th Street, Manhattan, between 2nd and 3rd, my grandfather, on the corner, assisted to walk from her Lenox Hill apartment to Melmont's. His wife flags an ice cream truck to buy him a sweet cone. Cabs assail the boulevard, their horns blaring as one towards pedestrians, defiant, in a crosswalk. His gray eyes shine to be outside at spring, to draw New York inside of himself. And this is where the memory stops. He turns to look at me. Thank you.
Beautiful. You know what? I love, I am very much a nature poet, and I've lived in LA, I've lived in Toronto, I grew up just outside of Philly, but I don't write about cityscapes much, and not sure why, but I love that you're doing that. And I have been actually to the Lenox. I know exactly. So it's like when you're writing this, I was right there, and that was cool. And you put me right there, and I love that. And I love being put in that. And you can't describe it any other way than in that New York scene. What was it that prompted you to write about that kind of like inner city moment, as opposed to like, I mean, it must have been like I'm sure it's been a very pleasant transition, but it must have been like a interesting transition to go from like Newark to the Valley. So what prompted you to write about the city environment?
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. This was the prompt was about the time where I felt loved or felt seen, and so the memory came up, and I was not searching for that memory at all, but it immediately went to my grandfather who lived in Manhattan for over 50 years, as well as his partner, and it was one of the last times that I'd spent with him in the city. And so that memory of being right there on the street, those small interactions, and then the
Oh my
white
God,
crazy
so that
noise.
moment of connection, right?
Right, right. In the middle of all that
Yeah.
noise was
Oh,
what really stood out.
that's
And
brilliant. That
yeah,
moment of connection in the midst of all that distraction.
right,
I
right.
love that. Yeah, that's a great point. Did you have another poem like that you would like to read on that?
Certainly. This one is a nature poem. I wrote this many years ago, and it's entitled Cacapon. Cacapon, the Cacapon River and Valley in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, a very beautiful place. I wrote this poem for the ancient Chinese poet named Po Chui. He was born in 772 and died in 846 AD. He was a musician and a poet and also a politician. And his poetry got him exiled for a time. There was a poem that was included in an anthology called Madly Singing in the Mountains. And so this was in my mind, I think, when I wrote this poem, Capon. Today, I choose a new point of geography and drive without a plan. I stop atop a summit, finding a foot trail. I take it. I move for 3 hours without seeing a soul beyond a single deer. I trek the mountain spine beneath a thick canopy of leaves. A rain pours over me, the leaves, everything. I wonder if I have walked into a cloud, or did the cloud flow into me? My body soaked in mist, I begin to sing. Thank you.
That was wonderful. So I have so many thoughts on this. Starting off with, today I chose a new point of geography. A different direction. Sometimes you start off with that different direction, and it's so fruitful and inspirational. And I just love that opening line. Today I chose a new point of geography. Because you need to go into a different landscape sometimes. And it's when you listen to that voice that's telling you to go into a different landscape, it often is also giving you like something to write about. I mean, it's often your muse doing that, right? To find a foot trail that will lead you to where you need to be at that moment, and speak to what you need to speak to. I love that feeling of the rain pours over me, the leaves, everything. Because like once you take that footpath and you embrace it, it embraces you. And it's hard to tell where the difference is.
Yes.
So these are some of the things I loved about that poem. Now I want to ask you about, since you're writing this in thought of a Chinese poet who is also a musician, I want you to talk about the relationship between poetry and music.
Boy, I think I would need an entire essay to answer such a question properly.
No, whatever comes off the top will be great. It's improvisational.
Yeah. Well, the music is a very big part of my life. I think before poetry, music was always present in my life through some shape or form. And so poetry, perhaps in the simplest definition in my mind, is word music. There is, the feeling that comes with music, the way that it takes you to different places, having a song that will, at least for me anyway, and I'm sure it's true for others, bring me exactly to a year or a place in time or a place in my life. And it happens instantly. It's quite magical. I've always found music to be that way. and there's always new music all the time, and I always love to hear a new song where it feels like I've known this song all along, in a way. Um, and the poetry can behave in a very similar manner, I feel. So there are poems that I love exactly the same way. There are poems that I read, and I have that feeling, oh, this is the poem I've been waiting for my entire life. Like an instant favorite. And so it's quite a beautiful thing. It's portable. It's anywhere that I go, I can be there, in music or in poem, and have those feelings and be reminded of that place, or maybe even the things that poetry teaches me. And So that's how I think I really do believe that the two are very intertwined. We do know, if we look at it in a um, through the lens of anthropology or something like that, historically, these roots go very deep uh, for both music and poetry. So I really like celebrating all facets of it.
So are you a musician?
I don't know if you ever stopped being a musician, but I
I
was a
don't.
trumpet player. I was classically trained when I was in middle school and high school. And so I've always enjoyed music. And even though I don't play as often or as well, that sense of musicality has never left.
So how do you, I mean, aside from the fact that, yeah, music and poetry can take you to a very specific experience, how would you say that your experience with music as a musician transcribes into your poetry?
Oh, excellent question. So, what forms of music have informed my education directly? I was very trained classically. I played a lot in the church that I grew up in, and also my trumpet instructor was a very fine musician as well. I'd never reached his level, but as far as the theory and the scales and the etudes and all of that comes with, I was introduced to that form, and it left an impression. On the other hand, my grandfather, who I mentioned, who lived in Manhattan for many, many years, was a humongous jazz fan. And so he taught me when I was learning the trumpet, my scales. He was introducing me to Miles Davis and introducing me to John Coltrane. And he had the pleasure of seeing these musicians play live in places like the Blue Note back in the day. So he gave me a very different spectrum. And jazz, as you might imagine, is improvisation, is coming up with creativity on the fly and even turning mistakes into beauty. And so he really taught me that in his own way. He was a saxophone player. He wasn't a writer, but he was a painter as well after he retired. And those influences really were a part of my own creative process, even before I acknowledged that I was a poet.
So I ask these questions because I I played jazz saxophone for like many years. Um, I am a big music fan. I often try to integrate specific musical phrases into my poetry. Have you ever tried to do that, like transcribe a a specific phrase of music that you find is like so powerful for you, and to transcribe it into words in a stanza or something?
Hmm. I haven't exactly, not taking a phrase of music. I do listen to music quite a bit when I write.
Mhm.
So I do think the music that I'm listening to can influence the mood of a poem or the tone that writing will take for me. Um, so that is an interesting challenge, taking a musical phrase and a phrase, right? Just
Yeah. No, I've done that. I've tried to do that several times,
Oh,
where I'm listening to something and a particular phrase will so grab me that I kind of put words to it and then just find a way to integrate it into a poem. Because it just is, it's like that being caught by surprise. It's one of those moments of like, okay, I have to do this. Um, and I am such a big trumpet fan, and Miles Davis is one of my all-time favorites. So good for you. Um, all right, so let me ask you a few other questions, um, sort of broadening the scope a little bit beyond your own particular style of writing and how you write. But what was it that what was it that initially drew you to the Poetry Society of Virginia? Like, um, what was it that you have gotten from the Poetry Society of Virginia? What was it that you thought you might get? What and what you got, is that the same as what you thought you would get?
oh, that's a wonderful question. The way that I got involved with the Virginia Poetry Society was through a gentleman by the name of John Berry, who for a time was the Northwest VP. However, I had known John in the Winchester area for many years. John was always a poet. He would organize uh, poetry readings at a coffee shop, at our local library, and this is years before I was realizing that I was writing poetry. I would show up to John's events and always loved listening to him read, always loved listening to other poets read. But I was like, I'm not a poet. I'm just listening. John stepped into the role with the Virginia Poetry Society, and he told me about it. And last November, he organized a reading at the Hailey Library in Winchester called Poets Give Thanks. And at that point, he had brought other folks from the Poetry Society. The PSV president came out, and I had a chance to meet Cheryl for the first time. And then we started to talk more and more about, well, what is the Poetry Society? What do they do? It all sounded very interesting to me. And so through conversations with him, with Cheryl and others, I decided to volunteer more often. And I feel like that is when things really opened up. Uh, First, I had no idea what a poetry society was and what it did. And I began to learn about the programs that many people put together, local readings like the one I just described, but also young poets and community. And I love the whole idea of youth and poetry because I do nonprofit work in that space as well. Just seeing the way that poetry can be used to bring community in the online sense, but also in the in-person sense. And to fast forward a bit, I had the opportunity finally to get to the annual meeting that just took place this past summer, and to meet poets in person. And I have to say, I was blown away. There was a reading that was done with a few former poet laureates. There were readings that were done for other members, and it was so beautiful and so humbling. I went back and told one of my friends, I s- I've always felt like I'm a pretty good poet, but I was in the presence of great poets. I just everything that I heard, everything that I experienced really made me want to become more devoted to the craft, because there were people that I was meeting who really understood what poetry is, and had a lot to teach and a lot to give. So it's been a great opportunity to find other folks and to not be alone in the space. It's been great.
You know, there's not a big difference between pretty good poets and poets that are presumed to be great. And it's good to keep that in mind. Um, you, what you say about giving back to the community, have you thought about like reaching out to your local school district and like reach out to the program lead and English language arts and say, hey, I am a representative of the Poetry Society of Virginia. I am a local poet. And if any of your um, school English program chairs would like to use me as a resource to come into the classroom and uh, talk about poetry, have a poetry workshop with the kids, but to like reach out to kids to give them a different perspective on poetry than what they get from the public school system, which is what drives them to fear and loathing of poetry. So it's something you might want to think about, because I am taking from you that kind of really strong community interest, and there is so much value in like reaching out to kids and showing them that there is something other to poetry than having to memorize a poem and spit it back to your teacher.
Indeed, indeed, there is. I have two teenagers, and so yeah, we look at the curriculum and some of the ways that poetry is presented, and these are very important poets, very important poetry. But sometimes to give them the life behind the story, how did these poets come to be? Why were these pieces important and carried through time? Is something that makes it come alive for young people.
That's so important.
Yeah, it's huge to understand. I definitely would be encouraged to engage more intentionally with
I mean,
school.
all you have to do is reach out, and
Yeah,
they can take it up or not. But the point is to do what you can do, and reach out to the school district, find out who the English language instructional lead is, and just reach out and say, hey, I'm here. If any of your teachers want to invite me into the classroom and take advantage of having actually a real local poet talk about poetry to their students, I'm here for you. So it's, think about it.
yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I think out where you are, I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. Do you have another poem for us?
Certainly. So this next poem that I'll read was recently published by the Shenandoah University Literary Magazine, which is called Avalon. And this poem is a bit of an homage to the work that I do professionally, which is in aviation. This one's called Aerials. Globe on a wing, fleur de lis, folded inside a paper napkin. 6 minutes to launch, an archipelago of horizons. A nimbus wakes from its sleep. Thank you.
That was exceptional and very powerful. It was so powerful, I would like you to read it again.
Certainly. Aerials. Globe on a wing, fleur de lis, folded inside a paper napkin. 6 minutes to launch, an archipelago of horizons. A nimbus wakes from its sleep.
That's such a beautiful ending. A nimbus wakes from its sleep. I totally love that. That was a brilliant ending. So what was the story behind that poem?
So I have also a very strong passion and interest in aviation.
Why? Where's that come from?
Um, well, it actually came from a fear of heights.
Oh, nice.
I was very terrified of heights when I was a kid, but also fascinated. I was fortunate to be involved in a youth and aviation program where I was invited to fly in a Cessna. This was in the 90s. My first flight was in a Cessna from Lincoln Park Airport.
Was that like a single prop or a twin
A
prop?
single prop, yeah.
Yeah.
We flew to the Hudson River and we turned down, and I looked left and I saw the Twin Towers at eye level, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And I thought, whatever this is, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And that was that was how I got hooked into aviation. But I also learned it was a way that I could approach that fear of heights. Once I was also able to go through flight training and then the solo fly an airplane. And so it was that introduction to both the beauty of seeing the world from above, but also, managing fears in that way. So since then, every job that I have had has either been at an airport or working with airplanes in some way. And so I today I'm surrounded by airplanes, as it were. In my role, I work for the government, and working in aviation safety, helping people get to where they're going day in and day out. And so the imagery in that poem, which was another surprise, it was not one that I had sat down to write, but there's little snippets of imagery from things that I interact with and my team interacts with on a daily basis, and they all kind of fuse together in that one brief poem.
Yeah, that totally comes across. And, I, without knowing you well, although I know you much better now than I did before we first met, um, I suspect that experience of free flight has shaped your poetry.
Yes, very strongly. I would
Yep.
say yes.
That I can just see that as a moment of kind of like conceptual, spiritual, emotional liberation, and I can see that as maybe animating a lot of your poetry, because I hear that in the poetry that you have read to us.
Yes, yes, it's very true. And then when I write, in general, and when I write poetry, it is a feeling of freedom that I'm celebrating, that I'm after, and so and poetry gives that to me, I feel, in a very powerful way.
It does, a very powerful and intimate way. It's a truly amazing, um, it's a totally amazing genre. It's like so totally different from like writing a novel or like writing a short story. Um, I always teach my students that, like poetry is so much more akin to music than it is to any other narrative form of literature. And I think that seems to come through in your poetry, and that's wonderful. Um, okay, do you have another poem for us?
Absolutely. This poem that I wrote for the Writing the Land project, the area that I had been paired with is called the Bull Run Mountains, which is west of Manassas, the city of Manassas. Most people will recognize the name Bull Run from the sites of the Civil War battles, the first battles um, during that time period. But the Bull Run, or the small river, begins up in those mountains. And so I had a year to spend time with this place to learn about the history, which was very fascinating. As many know, there's a lot of development that's happening in Northern Virginia, old farms that are being replaced by housing. And so one of the questions I had was, how did this place survive centuries of human activity to look very much like they did 100 years ago today? And so as I was learning and researching, I uncovered a really incredible story about close calls that the Bull Run Mountains had from being developed by different entities through the years. And one of the features that really protected the mountain was the mountain itself. Folks had known from the times of George Washington that these mountains were very rugged and very rough, and it's almost as if it formed its own protection because no matter what people did, they just couldn't find a way to conquer it and to make it livable. So those things were in mind as I wrote, and I really enjoyed the Writing in Land project. That anthology came out for the state of Virginia, featuring that poem and other historic environmental sites all over the state. And so I really encourage folks to check that out. So this is The End of Longing. Stones cobbled into a waist-high wall. Web and white seed tangled in the crevice. An emerald moss face southward. Still river marks, marking the light. How am I to know what a tree root can taste? What else comes after enough? Succor the blossom, the dead waiting leaf, a grinding sky released. Thank you.
That was brilliant.
Thank you.
I love the beginning with the bullet, kind of the bullet point images of, like, the scenery, the landscape. I do that a lot, like this, just place the reader. All right, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. Here's where we are.
Mhm.
And then getting
We may have lost Steve for a moment.
was that it?
I think we lost you momentarily, Steve.
So then you shifted from those bullet point, like here's where we're situated, to the reflective part of the poem, and you ask the reader, how am I to know what a tree, and I'm not sure I got all this, but how am I to know what a tree root can take? Is that right?
Taste.
Huh?
Taste.
Taste. Oh, even
Taste.
better.
Yes.
Oh my God, I love that. So then, you
I think we lost you again.
While we're waiting for Steve, hopefully he'll be back in a second. Can you read? There was another question after the tree root question. Could you read that again?
Sure. It's how am I to know what a tree root can taste? What else comes after enough?
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. All right, you're back on, Steve. Go ahead.
Thanks. And what are you thinking with that next line?
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. I'm not being easy on you.
Oh yeah. With this poem, it wasn't just the place that I was in. It was also there's definitely things of biography in there, even from the title, The End of Longing.
Yeah.
I've never written a poem quite like that. I think it was a feeling of contentment, of satisfaction, but also a question of knowing, like when we look at nature, it seems to always be ever supplying itself, ever replenishing, and no matter what we as human beings throw at it or the elements throw at it, it just keeps giving. And so the question is a bit of a paradox. What else comes after enough? Of course, enough implies enough is enough. But in our lives, we keep moving forward, and we're never stagnant as human beings. So I was looking both at nature, the way that it handles situations, if that's even an accurate statement, but also like, okay, what does it mean for me to be in that same type of place?
And that makes total sense. The concept of enough is one of those as if concepts that we give ourselves. which are just really we give them to ourselves as if like there's a stopping point,
Mhm.
and there isn't. But we give that to ourselves to just give us the illusion that there's a respite, a place to stop. Um,
I would like to
Go ahead.
I would like to comment on just the last part of the poem, because these elements also caught me by surprise, and I had to think about them for a while. But the last two stanzas, I read, "What else comes after enough? Succor the blossom, the dead waiting leaf, a grinding sky released." But what I did not realize I was doing at the time, but I was capturing the life cycle of a leaf in different segments, and each line is a leap in time. So the blossom, I imagine in wintertime, still closed and reclusive. And then I've gone through the bloom, and we're already in autumn time. The leaf has fallen and it's on the ground and waiting for whatever's next. And that grinding sky was about the decomposition of the leaf being turned into something else. And so I just wanted to point out those images because when I wrote them, it took me a few months to realize what had happened there.
And thank you. And that was exactly what I took from that. The it's like I have one of my own poems that talks about April, like when the budding blossom that already contains within it the withering leaf, um, and the bare branch, and I totally get that, and I think that the way you phrased that was so perfect, and also to convey that sense of like the end is always there in the beginning,
Yes.
uh, which is truly wonderful, and so well spoken. Um, David, I would like to invite you to read one more poem for us, and then we will close after that. If you have a poem that you would like to end us with, that would be wonderful.
Yes. This poem I'm still working on a little bit. I'm not sure how it will sound, but I haven't read it yet.
Life, it's okay, go for it.
Yes. This one is called CERN. CERN stands for the European Nuclear Research Center. It's in Switzerland, near Geneva. I was there earlier this year, um, and some very high-speed science happens there. There's a large laboratory where essentially this humongous apparatus that is many, many miles long accelerates subatomic particles to almost the speed of light, and then they collide. These particles collide in a chamber where there is a camera that takes about 30,000 photographs per second to record what happens. And then these results, this data goes to scientists all over the world who study nuclear physics. Well, I was really overjoyed to be there. And I was waiting for it to open, waiting for the visitor center and really nice exhibits to open. And I couldn't wait. I was the first person there. And while I was there, I grabbed my notebook and I just started jotting these lines. So this one's called CERN, and it's still a bit of an experiment.
So is CERN.
And it's spelled CERN. It's an acronym, CERN. Um, 1. I wait until the knowing swallows my dilated eyes, and all I am is light. 2. Or a universe balanced on single beams, parsing the illimitable, answering old question, of foundations laying, and time before time, we were here. 3, 4,000 miles, 4,000 years, and still, when I wake, my first thought is you. Thank you.
I love that. And like, I mean, just for me personally, like I follow the development of the CERN construction and experiment from its beginning. Um, who is the you at the end?
That's a good question. I
You don't have to answer it, because I've done that many times in my poetry and referred to a you that is so ambiguous and amorphous that it's up to the reader. But like, what were you thinking?
the earlier lines, 4,000 miles, 4,000 years. So the first one was 4,000 miles from home, which was the distance I measured from like Washington, D.C. to Geneva, Switzerland, roughly. But the 4,000 years, I think I don't even know how to describe that, but I do think about what our lives are over that span of time, if that can even be measured, if it makes sense. But we also know, like through poetry and through like just human emotions, there are things that have been carried very long throughout time, throughout literature. And so the you, it does end in an ambiguous sense, but also, as I mentioned earlier, there are some people in my life who have been my muse, who have been my inspiration, like my grandfather, like others. And so when I write today, I think about them in that sense too. Um, and it's very common for me to wake up in the morning and to think about somebody that I love. More particularly somebody that I've loved and lost, and just in the course of time. So I think those were the ideas that are in my mind. A very odd place to have them, at a place like CERN, where
Yeah.
these very deep questions and mysteries are being explored.
So, thank you, David, and thank you for your your brilliant poetry, your brilliant conversation with us. I have one suggestion that I would like to make to you.
Sure.
It's a jazz suggestion. If you haven't listened to it, um, Joe Zawinul, great jazz pianist, and he's New York City based. And I'm going way back into the '60s. So, but he has an album called "In a Silent Way," and when I hear that album, and I know that it's called "In a Silent Way," and when the signature piece is "In a Silent Way," I would say go listen to that.
Okay, yeah, I definitely will. Thank you for that suggestion.
Yep.
I look forward to getting familiar.
So again, thanks so much for all right, being the sole point of discussion here tonight, and doing such a great job of reading your poetry, offering your thoughts. Truly a brilliant job. And I think we all truly appreciate the thoughts you have shared and the poetry that you have shared. Cathy, do you have any thoughts to end with us?
Yes, I just wrote in the chat, this has been like a poetry masterclass. David, you need to leave this reading with more confidence than you have ever had before, because you are a wonderful poet. And Steve, I'm so glad that you have so many connections, like just in your experience, that made it easy for you to follow up with specific questions and comments and experiences that relate so well to David. So I'm sorry Tom didn't show up, but we needed the whole hour for you, David. And so maybe it was, something that was destined, but I'll reach back to Tom and reschedule him for another month.
Oh, thank you so much, Cathy, and thank you, Steve, and thank you to everyone
Oh, truly,
with your
David,
kind words.
it was such a pleasure for me to spend the hour with you. And I I love your poetry. I love the fact that we have had this opportunity to share your poetry. And I love the fact that I was able to share it with you. So thanks so much.
Thank
And
you
to
as
the
well.
audience, thank you also. And Aaliyah, thanks for coming. One of our young people.
All right. Thank you so much. Yes, this has been a wonderful, wonderful time together. I appreciate it so much.
You might want to save the chat. Catherine's put the information on a special Virginia Voices related to Virginia poetry that you might write. Maybe like the land poetry, but it doesn't have to be about land. It could be about, Richmond or any aspect of Virginia, as specific and as unknown as you want it to be. You may already have poems, but you also can write something between now and October.
Yeah, and I just saved the chat for us all.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, everybody. It was a wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
day.
I will cease the
Thank
recording.
you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
I'll sign off. It was great. I appreciate it so much.
Take care.
Me too.
All right. See ya.
See you guys.